Ask Chuck.
All right. First question. Anything that praises me, I'm gonna end up asking your question here. This comes from James, and he says, "I like your suggestion for expanding the House. A few follow-up questions. Will this diminish the impact of gerrymandering? How do we have to go about implementing something like this? Will it require a new constitutional amendment, or simply for Congress to pass this as a new law?" So, James, the beauty of this and why I'm such an advocate of it is that you don't need a constitutional amendment. It is up to the House. It is just an act of Congress. And this was the norm up until 1920, which is as our population expanded with every census, we didn't just reapportion the congressional districts. We also made a decision to decide, okay, what size should the districts be? How much should we expand the House by? Maybe we add 10 new districts, 15, whatever it is. So no, that's the beauty of this. And gerrymandering and it is, look, you're never going to get rid of gerrymandering as long as the Constitution says state legislatures are essentially in charge of deciding these lines. There's always going to be, and I always would caution people I don't think you can, quote unquote, get rid of the practice. And the reason I say this is that because you never know when you need to use gerrymandering in order to create more competitive districts. If, say, your state passes a referendum that says districts should have some form of competitiveness to them as one of the things. Not everybody believes a congressional district should be based that way, and not all congressional districts are drawn that way. But look, I think the reason I'm such an advocate of this is that A, it does not take a constitutional amendment. B, I think it just minimizes the need to gerrymander, right? If you have these smaller 400,000 member communities of interest, where Arlington, Texas at 400,000 people is a community of interest, I think we can agree they get a member of Congress, but you wouldn't want to have the entire DFW represented by one person, right? Or even half the DFW area. Are they really going to represent the interests of Arlington and Fort Worth, or Arlington or Fort Worth? Will they pick one? You see where I'm going here. So I think it definitely limits the need and limits the motivation of gerrymandering on that front. And then, of course, the other thing it fixes is the Electoral College, right? You double the amount of votes in the Electoral College, and you make it to where the popular vote and the Electoral College are less likely to be in conflict when all the numbers are set in. So, James, I hope I've made you now not just a supporter of the idea, but now an advocate. Go out there and evangelize about this. Uncap the House. Uncap the House, and we start solving some of our polarization problems in this country.
Ask Chuck.
Okay, next question comes from Eric C. How does an individual or an entity get to label itself as non-partisan? I'm thinking of advocacy groups or think tanks, even government entities, etc. I saw an individual sitting for an interview on what we'll call an unnamed news program, and the individual was from an advocacy group which the news program labeled as non-partisan, and it struck me as a potentially subjective label. As another example, isn't the Congressional Budget Office considered nonpartisan? What makes it so? Is it simply because its staff is not hired by anyone acting on behalf of either of the major political parties? Appreciate your thoughts. Thanks for the work on the podcast and interesting guest. P.S. How about some love for the Capitals? Go Caps. Yes, I am taping on Wednesday evening, May 7th. Bummed that the Caps are down 1-0 to normally a team that I would be rooting for, any team who's the Hurricanes, but not the Carolina Hurricanes. I don't root for any Carolina Hurricanes. All my Hurricanes are in Miami. Not even my friends in Tulsa and the Golden Hurricane. No, we only root for the Miami Hurricanes. So we shall see. Let's go. I have a lot of confidence that this Caps team is going to somehow it just feels like there's a narrative here with Ovechkin. He breaks the record, sort of one last hurrah, kind of like Brady and his Tampa Super Bowl, that maybe we get that. And one more Stanley Cup from Ovechkin. But you bring up a good point about nonpartisan, bipartisan, and all that stuff. I don't know if the word nonpartisan. I guess the one place that I've been comfortable having somebody label themselves as nonpartisan is active members of the military, because they have to be nonpartisan, right? They have to follow the commander, the orders of the commander in chief, no matter who the commander in chief is. So I think do you behave in a nonpartisan way? But everybody is born with, I always say, inherent bias. I always check my pulse. Okay, yeah, I'm a human being. Humans are born with original bias, is what I like to call it. Meaning, everybody has an ideology and a partisanship that is formed as much by where you're born, who you're born to, when you were born, the circumstances of your childhood. All of that is shaping. So it shapes you. And so there's bias, and where there's bias, there's going to be some form of partisanship. So I think these government entities, Congressional Budget Office, I would label as bipartisan, because essentially it's a staff that has been hired by people appointed by both parties, right? So that to me is bipartisan. The Federal Reserve to me is bipartisan. So I think bipartisan is a better version of that. I think nonpartisan, I think you're not wrong. It's not just subjective. I just think that, if you're nonpartisan, a partisan on the left or right might view you as an opponent anyway, because you're not for their side of things. You might, if you're using the descriptor of nonpartisan as a way to avoid taking a stand on something, are you actually being nonpartisan, or are you being sort of a silent partisan, if you will, by not taking a stance on something? So I think it's a fair point, and I think that I don't think anybody is. If the only entities that I think in American institutions that are probably best to be described as nonpartisan are the military. Look, I've always said, there's that ridiculous phrase that Roger Ailes and Fox came up with, fair and balanced. Well, I don't believe that the two. I actually think that phrase is in conflict, right? You can't balance fairness. You're either fair or you're balanced. And balance is also a very subjective word. So I think the best, the term I've always strived for journalistically is fairness. I'm going to be fair, tough but fair. That if I could be described that way, any interview that way, tough but fair, I would. And I think fairness doesn't always mean you're going to like all the questions, but they're fair questions to be asked.
Ask Chuck.
All right, last question comes from Dell. I'm desperate for someone to answer a question for me. It might sound basic, but I feel like it is basic. It's the very foundation of much of the political talk around the country. So when is this looming crisis of debt going to destroy us? Is there a number that triggers this? I just don't understand how, on a macro level, the debt of a country is detrimental, especially that of the U.S. Also, how will a potential catastrophe caused by the debt affect the average person? I mean, higher prices. We already see that now, from the pandemic to tariffs. So how is that any different? I'm just really confused about the boogeyman I've heard about for 48 years. It feels like the boy who cried wolf. Look, I tend to agree with you, right? And the whole, what we thought was debt to GDP ratio that we could withstand, turns out it was much higher, which many economists had said. As long as we're the reserve currency of the world, as long as the dollar is a safe haven, is it a safe haven anymore? Our debt won't matter until it does. So the problem is, if you do policies, I think if we continue to pursue the policies, these tariff policies, which then sort of send a message to the world that maybe we're not the free trade haven of the world, that we're not the safe haven of financial markets. If people start to question, what gives us the safe haven status is that we have a rule of law that is pretty good. That if we're suddenly not the reserve currency, then our debt holders, then all of a sudden, then you'd have interest rate hikes, and then this would just, it would have catastrophic effects, right? And this is what happened in Europe when there was a debt crisis with the Greeks, and there's been other countries where they've had that, but the other countries that have had these debt crises weren't reserve currencies and didn't sort of have our economic standing that we do here. So, look, I tend to think that we do overdo the debt issue, and it is sort of a convenient way to try to because the numbers sound so fantastical, right? And that debt clock is everything. But not some of that debt is bad debt, but some of that debt is debt that just about every Fortune 500 company would call good debt, right? It's debt, you're borrowing money today to finance something for economic empowerment tomorrow, right? You're borrowing money today to build housing, which will only create new taxpayers tomorrow, right? So I think we in the media do a poor job of explaining the debt and what it really means. and which debt is good debt and which debt is bad debt. But this becomes more of an acute issue if our standing as if we suddenly have sovereign funds all over the world decide that the U.S. dollar is not a safe haven, that U.S. treasuries are not a safe haven, and once they don't become a safe haven, well, then you sort of have runaway interest rates, and then that creates a catastrophe. But guess what? if the debt ever becomes a problem for America, the whole globe's in trouble, right? You want to talk about a contagion issue, right? It would, and in some ways, because you want to talk about too big to fail, the United States is too big to fail. So in some ways, it's probably why our debt's never going to be ultimately as catastrophic a problem as some might argue.